There is one number that I did want to talk about. You know, we're throwing around this number 30,000, more than 30,000, and we're not realizing that, first of all, it's completely inflated. But besides that inflation, 15,000 of that number are Hamas terrorists. There's no 30,000 plus civilians and the Hamas terrorists. We're including the terrorists in the number. Now, many of those terrorists may be 17, 16 years old that went into Israel on October 7th, raped and killed people, and we're considering that that's a child, which, again, when we hear women and children, we're expecting 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. And what I'd like to say is one Palestinian civilian dead is one person dead too much. Because this is my family, and I don't want to see one person dying. But when we take the terrorists and we include them in the number of the civilians dying, then it gives a false image of what's actually happening. So I don't want to talk less about what's happening. I want to talk more, but to be specific and to be accurate with the information.
Yeah, like we just saw the priest in Australia, Priest Marimar, that was just on the PBD podcast, I don't know, less than 6 months ago. He was stabbed, attacked by an Islamic extremist, teenager, 17 years old. By definition, he's a child. So if someone like that, an extremist of any capacity, is killed in a war, that is a child being killed in war. This guy tried to kill a priest. Secondly, we're also making the assumption that a woman can't shoot a gun or pull a trigger or throw a bomb. So nobody wants to see dead people. The images of dead babies anywhere, horrific. But something does need to be said about Hamas's entire blueprint, entire game plan, is they do embed themselves in civilian populations.
I can speak about that.
You were an IDF soldier.
Yes.
Like you did an interview that you were in Khan Yunis.
Yes, I was the first unit into Khan Yunis.
Which is, if you don't, there's Gaza City, there's Rafah that people are at, but Khan Yunis is what, the second biggest city?
Yeah, one of the
That's where allegedly the leader of Hamas,
Sinwar.
Yahya Sinwar, is hiding out. What was that experience like?
So for me, the war started as a reservist. I've been out of the army for 10 years. Actually, a lot of my work in the line is uniting Israelis and Palestinians so that we don't get into this situation. None of us want to see war. Unfortunately, on October 7th, we all know what took place with the massacres of the Jewish people, the rape, the burning, the cutting up into pieces, and I was called up into war. By 5 p.m., I was in Kfar Aza, which was one of the hardest hit communities that Hamas had hit on that date. Fought Hamas for 2 days, and then about a month later, our unit was taken into Khan Yunis as the first unit into Khan Yunis. When we got in there were no civilians. There was only one civilian that we saw. You know how you go on the streets and you see sometimes homeless people who have mental health issues and they're schizophrenic and they scream. So there was a lady, a woman, who was just like screaming, and she clearly had mental health issues. She had been left behind for some reason, and so we took her and we brought her to where there were civilian refugees. That was the only civilian that we saw. We also saw leaflets that the IDF had sent that was written in Arabic that you have X amount of hours to leave because we're going to come in with a frontal entrance from the IDF, so make sure that everyone's gone. But in all the civilian areas, houses, schools, you had terror tunnels, right? Hamas had built the scene for a war zone knowing that we would go in and being prepared. In the houses, they were booby-trapped with explosives to kill soldiers on the way, which many of my friends, unfortunately, died in this combat. And Hamas would pop out, come at us, shoot, attack. I didn't see any women Hamas terrorists. I'm not saying that that can exist. It was mostly men. It was mostly younger men. But unfortunately, that is the experience that we went through. Now, have there been civilian casualties that have died? Of course. But in no time have those civilians been killed because Israel said, oh, there are Palestinian civilians, let's go and kill those individuals. Every single time Palestinian civilians have been killed, which is horrible, the fact that this is happening, which is why we need to do everything to prevent ourselves from being in war in the first place. Every single time that civilians have died is because Israel was being fired at by Hamas. It needed to fire back. It warned the civilians to get out of place. Hamas forces those civilians to stay there. Israel shoots back and civilians die. This is what happens in war. But the difference is that Israel does everything to prevent civilian casualties and targets Hamas, while Hamas tries everything to maximize civilian casualties on both sides and specifically targets Israeli civilians. That is the difference here. So if we truly care about the problem of people suffering and dying on both sides, which I do, and we can be critical of the Israeli government. I have many critiques of the Israeli government. I mean, for 18 years, Hamas has been there. I didn't need to go into Khan Yunis to see all sorts of propagandas of teaching the youth how to hate the Jewish people in magazines, in comic books, in textbooks, in math books, in English books, of telling them the way to be an honorable person one day is to kill Jews. I didn't need to go there to know that that was happening. So why for 18 years has Israel allowed Hamas to exist, has allowed Hamas to manipulate its population, force its population to be in this loop of cycle of violence? Israel has the power, thus the responsibility responsibility to change the situation. So we can criticize Israel, but if we're going to talk about the situation, we have to be honest of what the intentions are of both sides.
Yeah, and very interesting. You made up a great point. In America here, in Israel, in any democracy, you're actually free to criticize the government. What happens if you criticize the government in Gaza?
Not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. I have many friends of mine that I work. Usually, you have to understand that the real leadership to Palestinians are not those in the Palestinian Authority and in Hamas. They're those who are local community leaders. You have different villages, they're almost tribal, and in each village you have one ruling family, and the patriarch of that family is the person that says, okay, this person hit that person stole this is what I say, you give that person, and they're really the ones who represent their population.
And if you criticize them, what happens?
Now, they are usually very open-minded to working with Israel because they care about the future of their people. But if they stand up and say something against the Palestinian Authority, against Hamas, or even on behalf of Israel, not even something against their own people, saying we would like to see a future where we live with Israelis, they disappear. So there is no freedom of speech for Palestinians, and I think when many Jews from my side, many Israelis are like, well, why don't we hear the voices from their own side? Well, they don't have freedom of speech, and that's also another big critique that I have for Israel, is we need to create freedom of speech for Palestinians as well. If in the West Bank, there's a Jew living there who says something and all of a sudden a Palestinian goes and kills him, there's justice. The IDF will go find that person, try him, and they'll go to prison for what they did, dependent on what they did. If a Palestinian says something and another Palestinian kills him, Israel does nothing. Now, of course, they're under a different jurisdiction, but I think that Israel is important to enforce freedom of speech and the security of human life for every single individual. And if we did that, then we see other local leaders that would rise up and have different thoughts for the population.
I want to play this one clip from Joe Scarborough. I started the segment off talking about, I do think there is some sort of double standard when it comes to Israel. And you actually give a great example about American involvement. So you gave the example of, like, I care about the Uyghurs, but we're not involved in China. But America has, I think, 800 bases all over the world. We have relationships with pretty much every country other than our enemies. We're everywhere. And we have, America, again, to your point, we can be as critical as we want here, and we could still do a show and show up to work the next day. Here's why I think you brought up the numbers. Like, 30,000 people have died. It's horrible. It's disgusting. He kind of said, look, got to be kind of realistic with these numbers because at least half of them have been terrorists. Here's what Joe Scarborough had to say about the actual numbers compared to other countries and other wars.
Even with American wars, they don't add up.
I want to show you one more clip of that, of Scott Galloway on MSNBC. Here he is absolutely demolishing Mika Brzezinski. Mika Brzezinski, who is the wife
20 seconds.
of Joe Scarborough. And, well, just watch this.
One of my pet peeves seems to be one of your pet peeves, and that is, 2 million people have been killed in the Sudan civil war. I haven't seen a protest at NYU for that. Assad killed 500 Arabs. I didn't see colleges burned down. 500,000 Arabs killed by Assad. Saddam Hussein killed over 1 million Muslims in wars. I gassed them. I didn't see protests there. And yet your school is shut down right now because Israel is responding to the worst attack against Jews worldwide since the Holocaust. Help us sort through that.
And we can debate that response.
Again, I don't know algebra, but I'm pretty good at the common denominators here and why there's no common denominators in all of these. It's just that it's Jews defending their homeland. Because if you look at the numbers, even with American wars, they don't add up.
Well, first off, good to be with you, and I especially appreciate your leadership on this issue. I'll give you some more numbers. 2,200 American servicemen killed at Pearl Harbor. We go on to kill 3.5 million Japanese, including 100,000 in one night. 2,800 Americans in 9/11. We go on to kill 400,000 people in Afghanistan and Iraq. We weren't accused of genocide. You had, if Mexico had elected a jihadist cartel to run their country, and then they incurred into Texas, and on a per capita basis killed 35,000 people, or the population of the University of Texas, and on the way back took the freshman class at SMU hostage and hid them under tunnels, what would we do? It'd be the great Sonora radioactive parking lot. But Jews are not allowed, and Israel is not allowed to prosecute a war. And they are prosecuting a war more humanely than we have done. The ratio of combatants to civilians is, of civilian death to combatant mortality is lower than it was in Mosul, lower than it was in Japan, lower than it was in Germany. So there's just a different standard for Jews in Israel when it comes to prosecuting a war. They're allowed to fight back to a truce. But unlike America or any other Western nation that has attacked us viciously, they're not allowed to win a war. It's a double standard.
Man, Galloway is really good, right? Like that.
So I actually genuinely want to get your opinion on this. Because you have a great response. You're like, look, they've killed 30,000 people. I don't want to see this. I want to see American involvement. in the majority of what they just talked about, Syria, 500,000 people. Sudan, 2 million people. Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people between Afghanistan, Iraq. They pointed out World War II, after Pearl Harbor, a couple thousand people died. We went and wiped out entire cities. None of these situations, when tens of hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people have died, was it called a genocide. Israel attacked October 7th, brutal, disgusting attack, which you know about all well too well. Waging a war. He said, listen, innocent victims are taken to war. It's horrible. 30,000 people. It's not anywhere near the level of hundreds of thousands or millions. Why do you think there's a double standard for Israel? He said to himself, Israel can only fight till there's a ceasefire. They can't actually win the war. Be unbiased. Why do you think that is?
I really don't feel like there's a double standard. Sometimes I feel like Israel is not held to any standard, just mostly because there are countless UN Security Council resolutions and other resolutions at the UN that Israel does not abide by. I feel like at this point they're attempting to find a military solution to what is at its root a political issue that's not going to be resolved unless the occupation ends, the blockade ends, and there are two states, or there's a settlement of the political conflict. There's Palestinian statehood, and there is the right of return granted to Palestinian refugees from the fallout of the Nakba, which was the day of catastrophe, or when over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled.
Do you believe that Israel is committing genocide right now?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But there's been multiple statements made by high-ranking Israeli officials. For example, just a few days into Operation Swords of Iron, which is what Israel calls this current onslaught, Yoav Gallant, the Israel, I think, defense minister, secretary, said that there's not going to, that was when they announced the total siege on Gaza, that there wouldn't be any food, any water, any electricity that was permitted into Gaza, and said that they were dealing with human animals and would act accordingly. There's also been other Israeli officials that said that they're going for damage, not precision. So I think you can inductively reason just based off of statements like that as an example, as well as the ridiculously high death toll, one of which constitutes a lot of minors. If you aren't comfortable with the term children, you could say minors, people under the age of 18 who may or may not have been involved in hostilities. That is big cause for concern for most people.
This is what I love about this conversation, because I'm going to give this to you now. You're smart. You're not an idiot. You're not. Part of the narrative is that people in the protests are smart kids that go to very smart schools, but they're also known as useful idiots. They buy into propaganda. I'm not saying that about you, but you have very strong feelings. I'm going to throw some stats your way, and then I'm going to give a very shocking question. And then I'm going to let him respond. You talk about genocide. You know, Jews know a thing or two about genocide.
You actually coined the term.
They coined the term, right? It's kind of our thing, guys. City of Gaza, 1990. 645,000 people live there. Today, 2.1 million, right? Mm-hmm. Not exactly a decline in population. World data, all of Palestinian population, 1990, 1.98 million. 2023, 5 million people. That's a 155% increase in the last 30 years. The numbers don't support a genocide. So I'm going to give a very shocking question right now. If you believe it's genocide, why doesn't Israel just kill all 2 million people in Palestine? Why don't they just, in Gaza, why don't they just do it? Just, you know what? You think we're doing genocide? The numbers are the exact opposite. We're growing. We have nuclear weapons. We clearly could kill all these people, but we're trying to be very precise and not kill innocent civilians. So if we are going to do genocide, why don't we just kill everybody? Why don't you think they're doing that?
Because genocide isn't a question of how many people have died. Genocide is a question of intentionality with respect to certain ethnic populations, deaths, the conditions of which they were killed. So and people often bring this up, like if Israel were really committing a genocide, if they're one of the strongest militaries in the world, if they're backed by the United States, why wouldn't they maximize the amount of people? Well, that is true that Israel has a military that is more than capable of eradicating every single person in Gaza, but then there's also public opinion to take into account. There's international law to take into account.
But public opinion is already against them. So like, I'm posing the question, and I'm going to let Rudy go in here now. I firmly believe there's embedded in many parts of society that there's just Jewish hate and they don't want the rights of Israel to exist. Example, October 7th happened. Israel didn't even have a chance to respond. You weren't even called into the military at this point. October 7th, October 8th, the world rejoiced. Israel hadn't fired one bullet. So don't tell me that there's no double standard, because clearly that was an example of that. I firmly believe, just by definition, that genocide is a reduction or a declination of population. They're multiplying like crazy. So you're actually a smart girl, but I'm actually pretty good at math. Genocide would be, there were 10 million Jews in Europe, now there's only 4 million. What happened to the other 6 million? Well, check the gas chambers, homie. In Gaza, there was 645,000, now there's 2 million. In Palestine, there was 1.98 million, now there's 5 million. I'm not seeing the genocide. Rudy, maybe I'm horrible at math, maybe I'm just a pro-Zionist. What am I missing here?
I think really the beauty in this conversation is that on the long term, we probably agree on what we'd like to see. And I hope that we eventually do get to that, because at some point this conflict will end and hopefully we'll be able to build off of those ideas. There are a lot of things that you said that I disagree with respectfully, and things that you've quoted of ministers who called people animals, which I think is deplorable language, but he was specifically talking about Hamas, not about Palestinians. Now, the reason why you believe that is because you read it in the newspapers that said, look at this minister who called Palestinians animals. And that's not true. He called Hamas animals. And I don't think we should be calling anybody animals. That's horrible language. But you see how we take one thing and we flip it into something else, and then it gives the impression that, look, these people are bad. They're calling human beings animals. I agree with you also. I was nodding when you said that genocide has to do with intent. We can't just look at the population from 48 and look at the population now. Clearly, since October 7th, there have been people dying. You don't have to have millions of people to die for it to be a genocide. You know, thousands of people being killed intentionally is a genocide, but it exactly is on intent. Israel's actions is always to fire at Hamas. And if its intention was to target civilians, why is it that when it fires at Hamas, it sends leaflets from drones and planes warning the civilians to leave? It sends knocker bombs, which is a loud firecracker noise that warns the civilians to go. It calls the phones and text messages the phones of the people in the area, warning them to leave. It really does everything to prevent civilian casualties. And every time that it's attacking, it's always targeting Hamas. So it does have to do with intention. Genocide is the mass murder of an ethnic or specific group of people with the intention to kill them. Now, have many Palestinians died? Yes. Horrible. Breaks my heart that we're in this situation, and even more so that my own people are involved with this situation. I would like for this to end, but the intention from the Israeli side is not necessarily to fix the situation. That's my big critique of the Israeli government. But it's definitely not to kill Palestinians, and we look at it with the specifics of the actions. And if you're claiming that the intentions was to kill Palestinians, then let's go to the specifics. Name me actions, name me times, name me places that there was a situation where Israel specifically attacked with the intention of wanting to kill civilians, and you won't find any. And thankfully you won't find any, because the intention of Israel is not to kill civilians. Now, with these terms, genocide, it didn't start in October 7th to call Israel committing a genocide against Palestinians. This has been said for a long, long time, even when I was a student on college campuses. What do we hear? Apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonization, settlements. Who's responsible for those things in the world? The West has done that. The West has done apartheids, genocides, ethnic cleansing, colonization, settlements. And today's far left, not the left, but the far left, feels so guilty for the crimes of their ancestors that instead of looking in the mirror for what they've done, what they're really doing is pushing off and whitewashing these issues and pushing it on the Jewish people and being used as a scapegoat like it's always have. And it's using the legitimate suffering of Palestinians as a tool to do so. Now, you spoke about the involvement of America in this conflict. I'm against the U.S. foreign aid to Israel. I don't want Israel to be dependent on any other military. That money is not even actually money. It's credits so that Israel can go and buy weapons, and that money and weapons is giving also to the Palestinian Authority, also to Egypt, also to Jordan, also to many countries in the region. And you ask yourself, why are all these players fighting each other? And then you have one country that's really funding and giving those weapons to each person. So I would like to see less of involvement from the United States in this situation, and more of bringing voices of real leaders from the Israeli side and Palestinian side to realize that our aspirations actually do not contradict. I don't believe there will ever be a two-state solution. If you ask most Palestinians, they will completely reject that. You ask most Israelis, they'll completely reject that. So we need to move forward towards a one civilization reality. And the reason I say one civilization, it's intentionally ambiguous because there's many potential ways of how to get there. Federation plans, Puerto Rico-style systems, emirate systems, canton systems like in Switzerland. There are many ways of which we can build that. But I think you're right that Palestinians need the right of return. It's not something I want, it's what they want, it's a non-negotiable. Palestinians need to experience freedom from the river to the sea, and what we need is full economic and political control over Israel. What we need is right of return for Jews as well, safety for the Jewish people, and that Jerusalem is our capital. And so when you break these things down, although right now they're positioned against each other, there is a way that we can create a reality that fills all the needs for both.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. If you like that one, click right here to watch the full SOSCAST, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.